In 1675, the King of England ordered every coffee house in the country shut down. His reason was simple. People were thinking in there, meeting, arguing, organizing. He was afraid of revolution. He was absolutely right. He reversed the order 11 days later. By then it was too late. The ideas born in those coffee houses that century rewrote everything. Democracy, capitalism, the free press, the stock market, modern insurance, the scientific revolution. One drink, and it literally built the world you live in. But what if coffee had never left Ethiopia? What if it had stayed a wild shrub growing in the mountains of a country most Europeans couldn't find on a map? Chapter 1. The Devil's Drink. When coffee arrived in Europe in the 16th century, the response was immediate. Ban it. Catholic priests appealed to Pope Clement VIII to declare coffee the drink of the devil. The logic was airtight. Muslims drink it instead of wine, which their religion forbids. Therefore, it is an anti-Christian substance imported from the East, a poison disguised as a beverage, a tool of the infidel. Pope Clement VIII tried a cup before issuing his verdict. His response? This drink is so good, it would be a sin to leave it only to the infidels. Coffee received papal blessing in 1600. After that, no religious authority in Europe could seriously prohibit it. But secular rulers kept trying, and this is the part worth understanding. Coffee was banned repeatedly across 2 centuries, and every single time the ban failed. Not because people ignored the law, but because alongside coffee, they were getting something they had never had before and couldn't give up. To understand why, you have to go back further, back to where coffee actually came from. The coffee plant is native to the highlands of Ethiopia, where it grew wild for thousands of years before anyone thought to brew it. The first people to use it weren't drinking it at all. They were eating it. Ethiopian warriors crushed the berries with animal fat and rolled them into balls that provided energy on long marches. It was nutrition before it was pleasure. The leap from eating coffee to drinking it happened in Yemen sometime around the 15th century in the Sufi monasteries of the Arabian Peninsula. Monks discovered that a drink brewed from roasted beans kept them alert through long nights of prayer and meditation. They called it kawa, a word that originally meant wine because of the way it altered the mind. From the monasteries it spread to the cities, and from the cities it spread everywhere. By the time papal approval cleared the religious objections in Europe, coffee had already turned the Ottoman Empire upside down. Constantinople had more than 600 coffee houses by the mid-16th century. Sultan Murad IV tried to shut them down. He had people executed for drinking coffee. He personally walked the streets at night with a sword and beheaded anyone he found with a cup. The coffee houses stayed open because what was happening inside them was stronger than any sultan's decree. People had found a place where they could think out loud, and no power in history has ever managed to take that away for long. Chapter 2. The operating system of civilization. When coffee reached London in the 1650s, it arrived in a city full of people who had things to say and nowhere to say them. Taverns existed, but people drank ale and gin there. After a few rounds, the quality of conversation dropped sharply. Churches existed, but only one person spoke on a fixed topic to a congregation that was not supposed to argue back. Universities existed, but merchants, journalists, and politicians weren't welcome inside. The coffee house solved all of this at once. For 1 penny, the price of entry at most London coffee houses, any man could walk in, take a seat, pick up a newspaper, and join a conversation that might last for hours. They were called penny universities. It was an accurate description. At a time when a university education was available only to the wealthy and the clergy, the coffee house offered something radical. A room where a silk merchant could sit next to a poet, who sat next to a ship captain, who sat next to a lawyer, and all of them could argue about the same things. What came out of those arguments was not just conversation, it was institutions. At Jonathan's Coffee House in the City of London, stockbrokers and traders gathered every day to buy and sell shares in the new joint stock companies that were financing global trade. They developed systems, created rules, built a mechanism for pricing assets and managing risk. The chaos of early financial markets slowly organized itself around the tables of a coffee house. Jonathan's became the London Stock Exchange, one of the most powerful financial institutions in human history, which still operates today in a building not far from where the original coffee house stood. At Edward Lloyd's Coffee House on Tower Street, ship owners, sea captains, and merchants gathered to exchange intelligence about vessels and cargoes. Lloyd began posting shipping news on the wall: which ships had sailed, which had arrived safely, which had been lost at sea. Underwriters started meeting there to share the risk of maritime trade, pooling their resources against the possibility of disaster. From that informal habit of information sharing grew Lloyd's of London, which 300 years later remains the world's leading insurance market. At Will's Coffee House in Covent Garden, the poets and critics of Restoration England gathered to argue about literature. John Dryden held court there for decades. The standards of English literary taste, what was considered brilliant, what was considered vulgar, which writers mattered and which didn't, were set at Will's. One table at a time, an entire culture was deciding what mattered. At St. James's Coffee House in Pall Mall, the politicians and journalists of the Whig Party exchanged information that appeared in the next day's newspapers and shaped public opinion across the country. The coffee house and the newspaper were born together, fed each other, and together laid the foundations of what we now call the free press. By 1700, London had more than 2,000 coffee houses, one for roughly every 200 inhabitants. This wasn't just an industry, it was infrastructure, the nervous system of the city, a distributed network of spaces where information moved faster than it had ever moved before, where people from different worlds collided and produced combinations that none of them could have produced alone. Modern capitalism, the free press, parliamentary democracy in its English shape, the insurance industry, literary culture, all of it took form in coffee houses, not in Parliament, not in universities, not at court. At wooden tables, in rooms that smelled of coffee grounds and pipe smoke, among people who had paid 1 penny to be there. Chapter 3. Revolution in a Cup. Paris, July 12, 1789. Jacques Necker, the finance minister the people considered their protector, has just been dismissed by the king. The news spreads through the city within hours. People pour into the streets. The tension that has been building for months, for years, for generations, is about to break. Camille Desmoulins jumps onto a table at the Café de Foix in the Palais Royal and delivers a speech that will enter every history book ever written about this period. He calls on the crowd to take up arms. He tears a leaf from a nearby tree and pins it to his hat as a cockade. The crowd does the same. 2 days later, the Bastille falls. It is not a coincidence that the revolution began in a coffee house. The Parisian cafés had been the laboratories of the Enlightenment for 100 years. Voltaire wrote his pamphlets at the Café de Procope, consuming up to 40 cups of coffee a day, a quantity his doctor told him would kill him, to which Voltaire reportedly replied that it seemed to be taking a very long time. He lived to 83 and produced enough work to fill 70 volumes. Rousseau refined his ideas about the social contract at the same tables. Diderot and d'Alembert used the cafés as a base of operations for the Encyclopédie, the project that attempted to systematize all human knowledge and threw a direct challenge at both the church and the monarchy. The French Revolution was made of many things: hunger, injustice, a century of accumulated fury at a system that consumed everything and produced nothing for the people at the bottom. But the intellectual architecture of the revolution, the ideas of liberty, equality, popular sovereignty, and the natural rights of man, was built in coffee houses. The café was where abstract philosophy became political conviction, where a man could hear an idea in the morning and be ready to die for it by afternoon. Across the Atlantic, coffee had already played its role in a different revolution. In 1773, Boston colonists threw a shipment of British tea into the harbor in protest against taxation without representation. The Boston Tea Party became the founding symbol of American resistance to British rule. And, in its aftermath, drinking tea in the colonies became a political statement, a declaration of loyalty to the crown. The Patriot response was to switch to coffee. Overnight, coffee became the drink of revolution, the drink of freedom, the drink of a nation that was inventing itself. Benjamin Franklin spent years in London and Paris coffee houses, conducting business and building the network that would prove essential to American diplomacy during the Revolutionary War. The coffee house was his office. That association between coffee and American identity has never faded. The United States today consumes more coffee than any other country on earth, over 400 million cups per day. This is not an accident of taste. It is historical memory encoded in culture, passed down through generations without anyone quite knowing why. Chapter 4. The Other Side of the Cup. Behind the beautiful story of coffee houses and revolutions, there is another story. It starts in the same place, Ethiopia, but it ends very differently. For the first 2 centuries of the global coffee trade, the Arab world held a near-total monopoly on production. The Ottoman authorities in Yemen guarded their coffee plants with the same intensity that modern states guard military secrets. Exporting living plants, or unroasted beans, was punishable by death. Every bean that left the port of Mocha had been treated to prevent germination. The world wanted coffee. Yemen controlled the supply. The profits were enormous. That monopoly began to crack in the early 17th century when a Sufi pilgrim named Baba Budan smuggled 7 live coffee seeds out of Mocha strapped to his belly. He planted them in the hills of southern India. Within decades, the Dutch had obtained their own plants and established plantations in Ceylon and Java. The French followed. According to a story that may or may not be entirely true, but is too good to dismiss, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu carried a single coffee seedling across the Atlantic in 1720, sharing his personal daily ration of fresh water with the plant through 6 weeks of ocean crossing and a pirate attack. That seedling was planted in Martinique. From that single plant descended the coffee trees of Brazil, Colombia, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and across Latin America. The entire Western Hemisphere's coffee industry traces back to a handful of smuggled seeds and 1 officer's water ration. And where there were plantations, there was enslaved labor. This is not a footnote. It is the central fact of how coffee conquered the world. The same economic logic that drove the sugar industry applied equally to coffee. Brazil, which today produces approximately 35% of the world's entire coffee supply, was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888. The coffee economy held on to enslaved labor until the very last legal moment, and plantation owners lobbied against abolition for decades. Not out of any particular ideology, simply because without that labor, the numbers didn't work. Today, the institution is gone. The economics are not entirely different. Approximately 125 million people worldwide depend on the coffee industry for their livelihoods, more than the population of Germany. The vast majority are smallholder farmers working plots of land smaller than 2 hectares in Ethiopia, Honduras, Vietnam, Colombia, and Indonesia. The average price these farmers receive for a kilogram of green coffee beans, beans they have planted, tended, harvested, and processed, is less than $1. A single espresso made from those beans, served in a specialty coffee shop in London or New York, costs between $4 and $6. That is 500 times more. The mechanism hasn't changed. The word for it has. Chapter 5. The Neurochemistry that changed history. There is a reason coffee became the fuel of the Industrial Revolution and not some other era. The reason is not cultural, it is not economic, it is biological. Before coffee arrived in Europe, the continent ran on alcohol. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It is a straightforward description of how European societies functioned for centuries. Urban water supplies were contaminated, rivers and wells fouled by human and animal waste, carrying cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Drinking unboiled water in a medieval or early modern city was genuinely dangerous. Beer and ale were safer because the brewing process killed most pathogens. So Europeans drank beer constantly, at every meal, in the workplace, at every stage of the day. A medieval English laborer typically consumed between 3 and 5 liters of weak ale per day, not because he was an alcoholic, because it was the safe option. Children drank it, pregnant women drank it, monks drank it, factory workers drank it on the job. The Europe that produced the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the early scientific revolution was, by modern standards, mildly intoxicated most of the time. Then, coffee arrived, and it worked in the exact opposite direction. Caffeine is a psychoactive compound that functions primarily by blocking adenosine receptors in the brain. Adenosine is a neurotransmitter that accumulates throughout the day and creates the sensation of tiredness. When caffeine blocks those receptors, the tiredness signal doesn't get through. The brain continues operating at the speed and clarity of early morning, even as the afternoon wears on. Reaction times improve. Concentration increases. The ability to perform repetitive, detail-oriented tasks without losing focus. Exactly the kind of work that industrial production requires is significantly enhanced. Europe in the 17th century switched, in the most literal neurochemical sense, from a depressant to a stimulant, from a substance that slowed thought to one that accelerated it, from something that softened the edges of experience to something that sharpened them. The timing is not coincidental. The great intellectual explosion of the Enlightenment, the acceleration of scientific discovery, the proliferation of books and newspapers and pamphlets, the sudden productivity of thinkers like Voltaire and Newton and Locke happened in the same century that coffee became the dominant beverage of educated Europeans. Historians debate endlessly about causes and effects in this period, but the neurochemical shift deserves more attention than it usually receives. The Industrial Revolution intensified this relationship. Factory production demanded something that agricultural work had never required: the ability to perform the same precise motion at the same speed for 12 hours straight, without losing focus or making errors. Coffee produced workers who could do this. The coffee break became standard not because employers were generous. It became standard because caffeinated workers were measurably more productive than uncaffeinated ones, and the brief pause paid for itself in output. Today, coffee is the second most traded commodity on Earth after crude oil. 2 billion cups are consumed every single day. The global coffee industry generates approximately $500 billion in annual revenue. All of it from one wild shrub in the Ethiopian highlands, growing unnoticed for thousands of years until a goat herder noticed his animals wouldn't sleep. Finale. A world without coffee. No London Stock Exchange as it exists today. No Lloyd's of London. No British press in its modern form. The French Enlightenment developing differently, more slowly, perhaps reaching different conclusions.
The French Revolution.
Perhaps later, perhaps not in 1789 at all. Americans drinking tea and feeling differently about it. An industrial revolution without the neurochemical shift that replaced morning ale with morning focus. Arriving later, looking different, perhaps not arriving at all in the form we know. One shrub from the mountains of a country most Europeans couldn't find on a map. Charles II understood what was happening and tried to stop it. 11 days, then he surrendered, because he had run into the one force that no monarch, no sultan, no authority in history has ever managed to defeat for long. People who had found a place where they could think out loud together. That is the real history of coffee, not the beans, not the caffeine. What happened when millions of people were given a space, physical, sober, affordable, open to anyone with a penny, where ideas could travel from table to table faster than any royal decree. Stock exchanges, insurance markets, revolutions, the free press, the scientific method as a social practice rather than a solitary pursuit. All of it was a byproduct of one invention. Not coffee, the place where people drank it. That place still exists. It just has different names now. And the question facing us is the same one that faced the men at Jonathan's Coffee House in 1690, or the Café de Foix in 1789. What are we doing with this time? What are we building? What are we deciding together in the rooms where we gather? Because everything that exists today, every institution, every right, every market, every freedom that feels permanent and inevitable, was once just a conversation at a table. The next thing that changes the world will start the same way. It already has.